We're going to be in Matthew chapter 1 this morning, looking at the genealogy of Jesus. And I know what you're thinking. You came here on this first Sunday of Advent hoping for a nice Christmas message to get the season started off right. Only to realize that today's message from Matthew has nothing to do with angels, or shepherds, or stars, or mangers. Instead of those traditional Christmas motifs, we're about to spend the next 20-something minutes studying a list of names. I won't pretend that I don't scan through the various lists of names scattered in the Old Testament rather than reading each and every one. You do it too, we all do. We can't help it. We don't care about genealogy nearly as much as our ancestors did. Besides, what can you possibly learn from a list of names? I know what else you're thinking. Part 1. Wait a minute, if this is part 1, that means we'll be studying Matthew's genealogy of Jesus again next week during the second Sunday of Advent. When does this madness end? Could there possibly be 2 messages worth of things to say about this list? Trust me in this, it will be a worthwhile investment of our time to look closely at these names and take the time to contemplate the ancestors of the child of Mary. So let us then begin in verse 1 of chapter 1 of Matthew. It says, a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. A record of the genealogy. So why does Matthew begin with a list of names? He starts his story of Jesus, his telling of the life of Jesus, with a list of names of all things. Well, this isn't actually anything unusual for biography, which is what this is, in the ancient world. Who you were had a lot more to do with who your ancestors were to them than it does to us. We live in an era when people can choose what to make of their lives. You can choose where to live. You can choose your occupation. You can even choose who you're going to marry. And we do all of that with a level of complete indifference to our ancestors, to what they would have done, what they wanted, what they did. We don't even think about it. That indifference would have shocked people just a few generations ago. But why Jesus in particular? Why is it important for us to know or to study or look at the genealogy of Jesus? Well, that answer lies in the title that Matthew will ascribe to Jesus and the 2 giants of Jewish history in his family tree. They were all listed in this first verse. The title comes first, Christ. Now, there are a lot of people who probably think that Christ is Jesus' last name. Aside from some entertainers who only go by one name, we all have a first and last name. The second being our family name from our father's side. But in the ancient world, people only had one name. So how are you supposed to keep track of all the Josephs or all the Elizabeths or all the Matthews when they only have one name? It seems pretty confusing. Well, they had 2 ways to identify who you were beyond just your first name. Where you were from, and your father's first name, father's only name. Thus, Jesus at times will be known as Jesus of Nazareth. But oddly for his culture, he is never called Jesus ben Joseph, or Jesus son of Joseph, because that's what ben means. Instead, Jesus lays claim to 2 different son of connections. He claims both of them for himself. He calls himself the Son of Man and the Son of God. The first of which is supposed to be a symbolic title, and the second of which he is being literal with. Although plenty of people were confused each time Jesus used either one of them. Matthew, rather than referring to Jesus by either his hometown or his adopted father, doesn't call him the son of Joseph, doesn't call him of Nazareth. Instead, he utilizes the now familiar title for Jesus, Christ. Now, Christ is not a Hebrew word. For all of Matthew's emphasis on the Jewish side of Jesus, he uses the Greek equivalent of the term Messiah. Messiah is the Jewish word. Christ is the Greek. The Messiah is a figure that looms throughout the Old Testament. Sometimes he is prophesied about clearly and directly, and other times he is hinted at in ways that are difficult for those who lived before its fulfillment to understand what it meant. Both Messiah and Christ mean anointed one. In other words, the chosen one. In the Old Testament, there were kings, there were priests, there were prophets who were all anointed at different times in different places for various reasons. They were chosen by God for that particular task. Ultimately, Jesus is the Messiah, the anointed one, the very ultimate chosen one. And he will in the end be all three: prophet, priest, and king. It will be part of Matthew's goal in his narrative to show how Jesus fulfills his anointing to become the Messiah. As a quick note before we move on, while we're talking about words that aren't really Hebrew, Christ is Greek, we said that, but so is Jesus. Jesus isn't Hebrew either. The name Jesus, the name that we always use, that we reverently lift up each week, is also Greek. In Hebrew, Jesus is Joshua, actually. Keep in mind, as we noted last week, that what we're really talking about is Yeshua, because there is no J in Hebrew. It's not Joshua, it's Yeshua. Jesus is simply a Greek translation, as it were, of that name. But that's okay, that's the one we're using, and we'll stick with it. He calls him the Son of David. We won't get to David's spot in the genealogy until next week, but Matthew highlights this famous ancestor in the introduction as well. The reason is simple. Being a quote-unquote son of David is a necessary requirement for any Jewish person who would claim to be the Messiah. The Jewish people were well aware of God's promises to David from 2 Samuel that we read this morning about his throne. They expected the long-awaited Messiah to be someone who could trace back his line that nearly 1,000 years to David himself. And if you couldn't make that claim, you really couldn't be their Messiah. They also calls him the son of Abraham. Abraham will be the first name in the genealogy when we start in a minute, the father of the nation of Israel, someone that everyone who is a Jew can trace back their ancestry to. To call Jesus a son of Abraham, therefore, doesn't make him unique among his Jewish brethren. Instead, it highlights the promises that God made to Abraham. Promises of blessings for his ancestors, and even blessings for all peoples on earth because of his descendants. So when Jesus is called both the son of David and the son of Abraham in the preface to his genealogy, Matthew has set the stage to show how Jesus is a fulfillment of the promises of God to the founding father of the Jewish people, Abraham, and to their greatest king, David. Now those are big shoes to fill. Not just anyone could hope to be both a king to his own people and a blessing to the world. It will take someone extraordinary to be that kind of Messiah. So let's look at the list. Look at some of these names. Verse 2 says Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. And here we have the trunk, as it were, of this family tree. The Jewish family tree doesn't actually branch off until it gets to the 12 sons of Jacob. Abraham had other sons, but only one of them was also the child of his wife Sarah. God had promised Abraham a son, even in his old age, but the child born to his slave Hagar, named Ishmael, was not the child of promise. Now that had been Sarah's idea in the first place, to try to fulfill God's plan using Hagar, but God intended to make a miracle happen. Abraham also had several sons after Sarah had died when he remarried, but only Isaac, the miracle son, whose very name means laughter, reflecting that Sarah let out a big guffaw when the angel predicted that this time next year she would be having a child. Only Isaac was part of the covenant that God made with Abraham. Now Isaac himself had 2 sons, Jacob and Esau, of whom only the descendants of Jacob are part of the Jewish people. Esau's descendants have become a separate nation, the Edomites. Now Jacob, we get down to Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons, the famous 12 tribes of Israel. But from this point forward, all of the descendants of Jacob will be the Jewish people. All of them will together go down to Egypt for 400 years. They will go down as 70 people. They will come back under Moses as hundreds of thousands. Before we look at the next verse, let me just tell you that Matthew isn't intending this list to be comprehensive. Some of you who can do math might figure that out if I didn't tell you. There isn't anyone added to the list that doesn't belong, but there are several generations skipped to make the list shorter. Now that isn't unusual at all in the ancient world. They did it all the time. You went from one famous person to the next. You knew there was a connection between the two. You didn't have to list them all. When we get to verse 17 next week, we'll see Matthew's reason for this particular listing. So let's get to verse 3 and 4 where it starts to get interesting. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Solomon. I want to focus on Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. And here we have a spotlight on a family scandal. You know, it was unusual in the first century to include a woman in a genealogy. Genealogies were records of fathers and sons. Mothers were not considered part of the equation. Matthew didn't list Sarah as Isaac's mother. He didn't list Rebekah as Jacob's mother, nor did he list Leah as Judah's. All of these women were respectable, and seemed like good choices. If you're gonna include a mother in the list, what was wrong with Sarah or Leah or Rebekah? They would have all been fine. But Matthew has another purpose in mind than respectability. Matthew lists 5 women in this genealogy. That's a huge number for that day. 5 women, 3 of which we'll cover today, the last 2 next week. But all 5 of them would be glossed over or hushed up by someone trying to highlight the all-stars, as it were, of Jesus' ancestry. If you were trying to list his awesome ancestors, you wouldn't have listed a single one of these women, probably. They all have a reason to be excluded. Instead of keeping the skeletons in the closet, Matthew chooses to highlight them by pointing out these 5 women and only these 5. By making an issue of these particular women, Matthew is asserting a couple of things. He's trying to tell us a couple of things. One of which is that God's Messiah can overcome a less than stellar lineage to become his chosen one, because God's hand is upon him. If we only listed the all-stars, some people might say, well, Jesus is the Messiah because look at all of these descendants. That's not going to be the case with Jesus. The other thing that Matthew is trying to tell us is that these women are not the black eye that they seem to be at first glance. Now for Tamar, you might be wondering, I've never even heard of her, so I don't know what to think about her. The story of Judah and Tamar is not one included in anybody's Sunday school material. We teach almost everything from Genesis, but never this chapter. It's a story of wickedness, of lust, of greed, and hypocrisy that would feel right at home on the afternoon soap operas. Would fit in perfectly with one of their plots. They've probably used it, I bet. Ripped it off, changed the names, and used it. Both Judah's oldest son, whose name was and his second oldest son, Onan, were wicked enough that their premature deaths were clearly a judgment from God. The text of Genesis tells us the Lord put him to death. And for the second son, the Lord put him to death also. Not good kids. Onan's crime was actually to shame Tamar by avoiding fathering a child with her. As was their custom, after his brother died, he was supposed to father a child with his brother's wife to keep the family name going for his brother. Onan didn't do that. He found a way around it, the kind of way that you can't explain in Sunday school, and he shamed her. So God put him to death. In addition to whatever faults that he may have had as a father, you got to wonder about Judah with boys like that. Judah goes on and commits fornication with what he thinks is a temple prostitute, but turns out to be his ill-treated daughter-in-law. Thus, the twin boys resulting from that sinful act by Judah are none other than Perez and Zerah. In the end, Judah realizes his own hypocritical self-righteousness. They say, your daughter-in-law is pregnant, and he says, burn her to death. And she says, by the way, who the father is, and he finds out and says, ooh, never mind. Can't exactly do that to her. Judah says, she is more righteous than I. Because Judah had failed as a father, Judah had failed as a man. So Tamar is an interesting choice for Matthew to point out in Jesus' lineage. She was a desperate woman, driven to a desperate act by a worthless husband, a greedy brother-in-law, and a lustful father-in-law. Not a single one of them treated her right. This wouldn't be the kind of story you'd tell later generations about good old Grandpa Judah and Grandma Tamar. I don't see you sitting around the fire with the kids talking about this story. So there's the first name in the list. Now we know virtually nothing about the rest of the names in verses 3 and 4. These are the generations between Judah when the Israelites were in the Promised Land, when they went down to Egypt, and when they came back 400 years later. It's 400 years, we only have 3 or 4 names. Like I said, he left some of them out. But we don't know anything about them. The next person that we know something about is in the first half of verse 5. So let's look there. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. So we went from a woman who, in her desperation, turned to prostitution, and now we have yet another prostitute. A foreigner to boot. Whereas the story of Tamar is entirely left out of Sunday school, Rahab is typically included in the story of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. Kids love Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, so we throw Rahab into the story somewhere. One little detail is left out, and that was Rahab was not just a foreign woman, a Canaanite, but that she was also a prostitute. Now, what her story was before the Jewish spies came to Jericho, we have no idea. How she ended up a prostitute, no idea. We're not told. And how she ended up marrying into the line of Judah after the fall of Jericho, we have no idea how that happened either. What we do know is that she acted bravely to protect the spies because she feared the power of God. Rahab is even included in the list of heroes of the faith in chapter 11 of Hebrews, right alongside Abraham and Moses and Elijah and all the heroes of the faith. Rahab's name is there too, because of her bravery, because of the tremendous act of faith in a God she had only heard rumors about. She didn't even know God yet, and she acted in faith. Thus, Matthew has a second woman in the genealogy who was caught up in prostitution, and yet at the same time blessed by God to be the mother of a son who would be included in the royal line of David, traced down as it began in that not-so-noble Judah. It certainly seems that Matthew is trying to tell us to open our eyes to the plight of women taken advantage of by lustful men, in a society where they had little power to protect themselves. All of this is in the lineage of the Christ. Isn't there any trouble-free examples that we can turn to? Isn't there anybody that we can say, hey, be like this one? Let's look at the second half of 5b. We'll finally find that. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse. Finally, we see faithfulness. Finally, we see honor. Now we come to a familiar name. One people still use in our society for their girls. I've never run across a girl named Tamar, and I've never run across a Rahab, but I've known several Ruths. We got one with us here this morning. How you doing, Ruth? The story of Ruth is a fascinating one. It entails near heroic qualities on display by Ruth, and even finally, a man who turns out to be honorable, even if Ruth had to nudge him a bit in order to get him to see what his possibilities were. You see, Ruth was a widow. As such, in the ancient world, she was at the mercy of the kindness of others, and she really had no other option than to find a second husband. Where Ruth shows herself to be no ordinary woman is when she returns to Israel with her former mother-in-law, Naomi, and holds fast to the God whom her husband had worshipped. Ruth's statement to Naomi is a treasure of loyalty, far beyond any cultural expectations that Naomi had. Notice Ruth's words. She says, "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." Those would be awesome vows for a wedding if there weren't the words of a daughter to her mother-in-law. They say it all. We're sticking together until death. But what's all this talk about your people and your God? Here's the kicker that makes Ruth's loyalty to her mother-in-law and God so amazing. Ruth was a Moabitess. That's right, a descendant of none other than Esau, the apparently forgotten son of Isaac and Rebekah, and now this descendant of Esau is moving back to Israel and soon will be the grandmother of King David himself. You see, God has once again, and Matthew is making sure we see it in this list, decided to ignore cultural bias and male chauvinism to offer a woman of character a chance to be honored. Tamar was taken advantage of by 3 men. Rahab by who knows how many men. Will Ruth be able to find an honorable man to redeem her from her near starvation level poverty that she finds herself in as a widow? Well, Boaz turns out to be such a man. He offers Ruth a small kindness while she gathers leftover grain in his field, and then finds himself powerless to resist the not-so-subtle hint suggested by Naomi and carried out by Ruth that he should marry her. Boaz was a close relative of Ruth's deceased husband. By Jewish law, he had a right and obligation to marry this widow if only one other relative would get out of the way. And that one eventually passed on the opportunity. So it was the same sort of obligation. Notice it was the exact same obligation that Judah's son had made a mockery of when he violated and shamed Tamar. But Boaz is better. Boaz chooses to fulfill his role as a kinsman redeemer and does so with all the necessary propriety. In doing so, Boaz becomes an example of the type of redemptive relationship that God is hoping for, that God is hoping to have with humanity through the very Messiah that Matthew is beginning to write about with this list. In the end, Jesus will willingly step in and rescue a humanity that is far more desperate and far less worthy than Ruth, by becoming the symbolic husband of the church, by becoming a kinsman redeemer like his ancestor, Boaz. Now, next week we'll look at the second half of the genealogy from David to Joseph and Mary. It too contains some lessons for us. So what have we learned by looking at the list of the ancestors of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham? On the negative side, it will take far more than an ordinary man to overcome the scoundrels hiding in this family tree. That's something we know God had a unique solution for, because Jesus is no ordinary man. On the positive side, there are people of moral quality here, like Boaz, who simply did the right thing. And then lastly, there are these three women, often ignored by their culture and often ignored by history, but highlighted in the story that God is going to be telling. Highlighted because of their sorrows, but also highlighted because of their faith, and ultimately judged by God as worthy mothers within the line from Abraham to David to Christ.